Well, thanks very much, Chris, and thank you very much to Mount A for inviting me here. I know a number of the people that teach in the art department and have known them for a few years, sort of peripherally the way I know Chris and Leah and Adriana and Eric and Eric's wife, Andrea, I should give her a proper name. And I have to say, people say this and it's sort of like hot air, but I actually really mean it. I feel it's a real honor to be invited to Sackville because I feel the energy that's going on here and the community that has sprung up over time and particularly in relationships with people I know over the last few years is really exciting. And I was thinking about artist talks and in some ways how I don't think particularly when you're working in the studio, unless you're a performance artist, you think about performance, and there's something for me, a little bit uncomfortable about an artist talk, a bit like I'm a performer, which I'm really not. And so I was thinking, okay, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is you have a community of artists that all get together and they just talk to each other about what they're doing. And I feel very happy and honored, as I say, to have been invited into this community. So thank you. I have a lot of images I wanted to show tonight, but I'm going to show them quickly because I was really like an artist talk where you see a ton of stuff. On the other hand, I don't particularly want to go to an artist talk and sit there for the duration of the night until the early morning, silently in my chair waiting for the person to be quiet. So I'm going to go through the things fairly quickly. But like Chris was saying, I am a somewhat of an energetic talker. And my students have told me on more than one occasion that I can be confusing. I feel like I'm the kind of model of clarity, but they tell me otherwise. And so if I do go too fast, or if I say things that seem puzzling or odd or wrong, just stop me and ask a question for sure, or make a comment. That would be just great if you feel like doing that. But I will try and get everything finished in a timely way, so there's time for conversation afterwards if people are interested. And before I begin with a great slew of pictures, I just wanted to make two comments, two umbrella comments about my work and about studio practice generally, I think. On the one hand, when I look back at the work of the last, 13 years, it's quite various. So at times I'm painting in very traditional means on very traditional rectilinear flat surfaces. And at other times I'm working on shaped surfaces or directly onto the wall or in constructed surfaces. Sometimes I'm drawing with traditional media like watercolor. Other times I'm drawing with things like thread onto canvas. So there's a fair amount of diversity in terms of my material approach. Sometimes I'm working with figuration in a very cartoon-like way. Other times I'm using appropriated images. Other times I'm working in a very traditional representational kind of way. And so these are all differences I think you can see in the work. But the things that stitch those differences together are the concerns that have been with me for a really long time, I think, probably since before I began art school, maybe since the time I was a small child and drawing. And I guess the primary one is the search for narrative. And as a result of the search for narrative, there is the requirement, I feel, to find space for characters to experience event and time for those things to unfold. And John knows this, I know. I just wanted to to use the words of a much better writer than myself. A French poet called Yves Bonfoy, who wrote a lot of criticism about art. He was a beautiful and interesting writer about painting. And one particular essay from a book called The Lure and the Truth of Painting, one particular essay, it's called Time and the Timeless. And he's talking about the change in the Quattrocento, the sort of 13th century, into the early Renaissance and how spatiality changes in that time. So if you can mentally picture a Martini painting, very flat, golden sky, no perspective, or if there is perspective, it's very weird, kind of jumbly perspective. Everything's really very flat on a vertical picture plane. So you can picture that, and then picture moving into someone like Masaccio, where all of a sudden buildings have a three-dimensional illusionistic quality, and figures seem to be orientated in, real spatial depth. Well, the traditional way of thinking about that is to say that, whoa, someone came along, really smart person, came along, invented perspective, and all of a sudden we have space in painting. And Bonfoy says, no, yes, perspective allowed space to happen. But space only happened because at that time, that period of time, there was a requirement for a different kind of time to be depicted. And so he talks about Martini as being the time of God, the time of the unreachable infinite that we can only ever see as a vertical plane, changing to the time of humanity, which is lived experience. It's experience that we walk through and pass through. And so spatiality has to be developed to allow for, what's his phrase, the figure of existence and not of God. I think that's an absolutely exquisite description of spatiality. It doesn't seem to me it flies in the face of other kind of conversations about perspective, but enriches that conversation about perspective immeasurably. And so I would say that throughout my whole practice, this search for space has been going on. So that's one of the umbrellas. The other umbrella is that in a talk like this, there starts to be, you show a whole bunch of work, there starts to be a kind of inevitability of this work had to turn into that, and this work had to turn into what follows it. And what that leaves out is all the dead ends and misturns and fumblings around that happen in the studio. And when I've tried to think about how I actually do proceed in the studio, it seems to me that two different kinds of experiences happen. And I'm never quite sure of how to arrange the balance between these two things. And on the one hand, for me, there has to be a critical or intellectual engagement with art making. So it could be with representation, it could be with painting, it could be with the cultural moment. But I have to be thinking about it. I have to think about painting's history, and I have to think about the relationship of representation to the contemporary moment when we're kind of flooded with images. I have to do that work. And I also have to work hard. For me, I'm just someone that, nothing happens for me unless I'm in the studio in a fairly rigorous, fairly daily way, just working. And that's one side of the equation. And then the other part is the thing that we just stopped talking about in the late 20th century. When I went to art school, no one used this word. It was a rude word. And that was intuition. And we just didn't talk about it then. And I still don't really talk about it with my students. I use a synonym. I say, wait for your hunches. And what I mean by that is that moment when you just have a really great impulse and you follow it because you kind of have to. For me, those are rare moments in the studio practice, but they're absolutely the best because they take you to the place where you figure out something that you didn't know that you knew, and all of a sudden, it's there in front of you. I love those moments, but they wouldn't come, in my case, they wouldn't come without the other stuff. So those are the two umbrellas. And so, yes, the images are going to look kind of like, oh, it was inevitable that these things happened. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't. There are probably dozens of little winding paths that this work could have gone through. So if we could start with the slides, Lucy. I graduated with an MFA in 1993. Before that, I went to NASCAD, where I graduated in 1990. And my training, or rather what I learned, because one of the things I've realized through teaching is that students learn what they need to learn, not always what the instructor thinks they're teaching. So what I learned was Greenbergian modernism, which is to say, this is all about painting, that a painting had to be flat and could not be narrative. So on the one hand, I had a strong Greenbergian modernist education, and on the other hand, I had a postmodern education, which is to say that painting could address any subject it wanted to, so long as it did so in a deconstructive way, and with the knowledge that the only kind of spatiality that existed was flat spatiality. And for those of you that sort of can mentally picture these people, the painters that we talked about were people like David Saleh, Gerhard Richter, Schnabel, I suppose to a certain extent, Sigmar Polk. It's all about a very flat, image-based kind of spatiality and narrative that was so in quotation marks that it was very different from the kind of narratives that art history had previously been involved with. So I came out of school. When I did my graduate studies, I went to a very, very good graduate program, but it was in Chicago, and it was at the absolute apex of time of social critique. And so I was the only painter in my program, and everyone was engaged with social critique. Even me with my paintings, like, oh, how am I going to make a social critique this way? I mean, this is like, for one thing, you know, it's a history that's totally bound up with the ruling class. For another thing, it's a very elite practice. How's this going to relate to the guy on the street that's never been inside a gallery? There's a whole feminist critique of painting. So here I am kind of going, oh, I'm trying to make a social critique, but I don't know how to do it. I came out of that program feeling like anything I knew and believed in painting was scratched right down to the bone. So if we could begin. So I'm just going to show, is it possible to switch the lights off or down? That'd be great if it is. So I came out of the MFA program having made work that was still figurative, believe it or not, still figurative, but in the most minimal possible way. So the figures that you're seeing here are stamped. I made these little tiny stamps out of styrofoam and cardboard, and they are washed over with white paint so as to be almost invisible. I don't know which one I'm supposed to press. The previous image was called Coming and Going. Sorry, the previous image is called Swarm, and this is an image called Coming and Going. And so you see these little stamped legs. I'll show you in detail. You see these little stamped figures washed over with white paint. Sorry, I'm being very slow here. What seems really interesting to me is that the figure remained. Even though I was kind of cut right down to the bone as a painter, the figure remained. Anyway, so I came out of grad school completely unsure of what I was doing. And for the first 2 years of my studio practice after grad school, I just made other people's work. Which is to say, I just ventriloquized myself into something that I thought would be suitable for an artist to do. So we moved to Ontario. There had been a change of government from an NDP government to a Conservative government, and the leader of the government was this guy called Mike Harris, who was a professional golfer, and he was just the sort of front man, the sort of beefy front man for a really hideous government. And so the ministers, oh geez, the ministers just said unbelievable things. I can't actually remember who this minister was, but he said, if you can believe it, you have no proof except one person and a few women. I mean, this was like, what was this, 1995, I think? Unbelievable. And they said things like the Minister of Transportation, who was a used car dealer, said, I believe in public transportation when you can't afford a car. So, I would read these things in the newspaper each day and just not believe it. So I made a group of jackets called the Harris Team Jackets. They had public transport if you can't afford a car. They had a slogan by, believe me, these are verbatim from the newspaper, quotes from these guys. That was written on the back, and on the front there was a little price tag, what that would cost to the people of Ontario. So I made the Harris Team Jackets, and that was all fine. And I fell in with a group of women at the Theory Center at the University of Western Ontario, who I really liked. We got along extremely well, and we decided to do a feminist rewrite of Courbet's Origin of the World. The Origin of the World is a painting by Courbet, and there's a very funny description of it in some catalog. I can't remember who wrote it, and it said, it is a painting of a woman. The woman has no arms, no head, no neck, no legs, no feet, no knees, no stomach, no breasts. So basically, it's just a painting of a woman's vagina, which is what the painting is, or groin at the very least. So what we did with this group of women, I think there were 6 of us, I painted the portrait of each woman in the pose of the Origin of the World. And then each woman decided what she wanted as a cover for this painting, because it had always, from the time it was painted by Courbet, had always had a cover on top of it. So this is, I've been very discreet here. I've showed mine not opened up. So this is mine. This is a friend called Nancy Ring, who is an art historian. She wanted a fragment of a Clifford still, which just seemed weird to me. Another friend in the corner, she wanted a mirrored door with peepholes in it. I know. They were kind of fun, it has to be said. And Karen wanted an ear, for various reasons, an opening into the body, the place where text enters into, and meaning, and so forth. So she had an ear. I don't know how I'm doing this wrong. This is Nancy's closed, what you would see when you came in, and Nancy's open. So they, I don't know how well you can see the little key, but if you went into the gallery and were interested enough, you could pull a little key and find out the painting underneath. And again, perfectly lovely work, nothing wrong with it. It's just it wasn't my work at all. It was me trying to be the kind of artist that I thought I should be. And the first point at which I began to be able to make, actually this is a good point. So my cover was an O stitched. And I like this because it's an opening, and it's a 0, and it's a letter, and it's something that you might say. But it was cream-colored thread on canvas, so it was sort of invisible, and the only way you could find it was by touch. So you can do the rest of the deconstruction yourself. But the interesting thing for me in retrospect is that through working, I prepared the ground for the first good hunch I ever had in my studio practice. I'll get to that in a minute. There it is again. So the first point at which I began to actually make work that belonged to me was when I thought about something I had read by Robert Irwin, who's I think, an incredibly wonderful artist. He's elderly now, living in California, and an equally great writer and teacher. And one of the things he said was he inverted the usual thing. It's not that you look for the right answers, you look for the right questions. And so the first sensible question I asked myself all through my education and afterwards was, what kind of work are you actually interested in? And I wasn't interested in, I like political critique. I think it's fantastic, and I'm glad someone's doing it. But that's not the work that if I was alone on a desert island, I would want to have a book of social critique with me. It's probably just not. When I go to the museum, it's not the first place I go. First place I go is to look for narrative. And social critique, of course, can be narrative, but I was looking for different kinds of narratives. So the first sensible question I asked myself was, what kind of work are you interested in? And the answer to that was, I'm interested in narrative work. And I began to look for narrative in all different kinds of places. So this is a very early, this is from 1995, I think, a wall painting that I did in Halifax at the Anna Leonowens Gallery at NASCAD, actually. And it's made up of tiny bits of marginalia, so every single image here, and it's actually a very difficult piece to show because it was so pale. Every single element here was something that was found in the corner of another painting. So this thing here, although it looks like a letter, was actually just the gloss on a graphic representation, probably someone like Liechtenstein on a glass, on a drinking glass. Little tiny chair, couple of guys fighting. You can't see these things. That was from a Japanese image. Just a bunch of stuff, all borrowed from pre-existing work. Like I say, it's very hard to actually show this work. Sorry. So the Anna Leonowens show was the first place where I felt like I'm actually not trying to be someone else. I'm actually trying to be myself. But it came with a lot of problems because the kinds of narratives that I could construct by kind of jumbling all these things together were very disjointed. And at the time that I was starting to make this work, there was a whole lot of stuff. There was sort of Roland Barthes talking about the construction by the reader of the narrative, the death of the author, the idea that an artwork is made by the receiver as well as by the producer. And all of these ideas were really kind of common currency. And there's a lot in them that seems to me pretty undeniable. On the other hand, there has never been a point for me in terms of my aspirations with storytelling that I've ever wanted to hand it all over to the reader. I have to say, there's something about that just seems kind of lazy to me. And the stories I love are the ones where someone tells you a story. And I have tried, from the time I was certainly in art school, I have tried to do that, sometimes with a little more success, sometimes with a lot less success. I'm still struggling with that. How do you just tell a good story? So the problem with these wall paintings was that they had moments that were potentially narrative, but all put together, they were not narrative. So this is a wall painting I did at the Koffler Gallery in Toronto. And You can see the change from the, or I don't know if you could see it terribly well, from the Leonowens wall, where things were just as if graffitied right onto the wall. Here, these things are painted trompe l'oeil to look as if a little tiny piece of the story has been taped to the wall. So there's beginning to be just the shallowest suggestion of space is starting to enter into the work. A detail of a thing. And it looks like there's a giant footprint on it, which might be just a giant thumbprint. Anyway, that's not part of the work. So tiny little narrative, this glass of water being spilled. But because this little tiny narrative is butted up against a bunch of other stuff, it starts to be a bit like listening to static on the radio, where you hear, you know, the odd word or the odd phrase, but you can't really make sense of it because it's jumbled in with everything else. And that could be a very, very interesting way of constructing narrative. It's just not, I don't think, still, maybe I'm starting to get there, the kind of narrative I was interested in at the time, at any rate. I'm just going to dash over this. It's such a crummy slide. Just another wall drawing at the University of Western Ontario. But I think what's the reason why I would even bother to put this in is because there's starting to be the idea that, yeah, okay, I can actually, Greenberg is actually safely in his grave. I can begin to make paintings that are not merely flat, but are beginning to be spatial. You know, there's a sense in which I kind of listen to myself talk and I think, for God's sake, woman, if you wanted to make spatial paintings, why didn't you just do it? And I don't know why I didn't. I couldn't. I guess I've always been a fairly compliant and obedient person. And when I was told you have to make flat paintings, I thought you had to make flat paintings. It's been, you know, gradually getting older and tougher has allowed me to make them more spatial. Anyway, the first good hunch, I have no idea why it happened, unless it's because of that Arago stitched piece I did, that circle. One day I thought to myself, I'm going to sew these things. I'm going to sew these drawings on cloth rather than painting them on the wall. And so I did. And I actually really I still like this work. So instead of piling a bunch of images together, I allowed there to be a single narrative moment. This is just called Two Monkeys. And I'm most definitely working with all of the kinds of things that a cartoonist is interested in. So gesture and expression and humor, I think, as well. Obviously, one monkey has something and the other monkey doesn't. And that's all you need. That's all you need to know. One of the things that it seems to me happens with an image like this one, though, is that there is definitely a past. Although we're not 100% sure. Look, if you look at the way the little claws are kind of curled out, is he going to grab it? Or was it just grabbed from him? There's some kind of past there. There's some kind of present, and there's potentially some kind of future. So even though it's just a fragment of a second, a fragment of an instant here, there's a longer narrative that this is part of. And I'm going to zip through these because I have a bunch of them, but I just want to show them quickly. This is called Feast. Again, sort of a pregnant moment. Caress. Sailors, a little bit hard to see, but what is, I guess, relevant about this work is that this is relatively high contrast, and they're stitched in a sort of silvery gray blue thread, so they really kind of melt into the white of the cloth. So even though they're very, very material, there's a kind of a spatiality that's going on just through contrast perspective. Packed. Sorry about the gruesome thumbprint. That's just on the slide. That's just messy. King and Queen. Burden. Oh, I love. This slide could be better, but I like the title. It's Fierce Lion and Seven-Eyed Goat. Don't ask me. Reminiscence. Okay. So reminiscence, in a way, I don't know how clear that last image was, but what we're looking at, obviously, is these chopped logs, and behind it there are these little mountains with trees on them. And as I do love words and language and titles, and so the word reminiscence here, the word is it's not as important as the drawing, but it's very important to the drawing. So when you see the drawing and you read reminiscence, it seems to me that you then must extrapolate that whoever is remembering is the logs, and what are they remembering? They're remembering back when they were a forest. And this is one of those, there's a phrase, and I don't know who said it, it's the unthought known. And it's a phrase I really, really like, because I believe in my own studio practice, there's times when I know things that I actually don't yet know that I know. And one of the things that I didn't yet know that I knew when I was making this work was that there was a whole body of my work that was entangled with the current experience of living in the world that we live in now and watching things like climate change and the sort of proliferation of highways and the degradation of natural land and so forth. And I didn't know I was bothered. I mean, I knew I was bothered about it, but I didn't know it was entering into my work until it was there kind of really strongly. And reminiscence is maybe one of the thinnest edges of the wedge. But fairly soon thereafter, I made this piece, which is called Peaceable Kingdom. And I don't know if you guys know the Peaceable Kingdom stories, but it's the idea, it's a biblical idea that I guess in paradise, all of the creatures of the world will live happily with each other. They'll live in peace with each other, and it's an ideal, obviously. But it's such a nice idea in some ways. So I found this old lawn chair fabric, and it was kicking around the studio for a long time. And then one day I decided I was going to start stitching animals into it, which I did, and gradually the whole thing turned into a Peaceable Kingdom drawing. So there's a little beehive. Oh dear. A goat grazing. And then there's these guys. There's, I think there's 47 animals. I didn't want to put too many images in, but I think there's 47 animals in the whole drawing. And that includes this here. It's a pen with the human beings in it, but unfortunately the gate has broken open and the human beings are just starting to walk into the Peaceable Kingdom. So all the animals are doing fine. They're all relaxed and enjoying themselves. But unfortunately the floodgate has just broken and the humans have arrived. And here they are. They're kind of standing around like nebbishes really, but they're going to make trouble. So that Peaceable Kingdom drawing became a kind of route for a number of different pieces that I'll get to in just a minute. While I was doing the stitched work, I was still continuing to work with paint. And working on the wall, I don't know if you guys felt this morning, but when you're working on the wall, did you find, I don't know if you found it liberating. It's, you know, you got this huge canvas. It's a really nice place to work. The problem is, as you guys know, you're there, you look at the work, it's great, and then someone comes on 10 minutes later and says, go and take this mess with you. And that's happened to me with every single wall painting I'll show you. There's not one of, well, there is one that still exists, but the rest of them have all been covered over. And that's, you know, it's fine, but it can be annoying. So in addition to working directly on the wall, I started to work on panels. And I found that working on the rectangle was so constraining, I just couldn't do it anymore. And I started to look at, I'm very interested in medieval work. It's like, I suppose, my favorite period of art making. And I started to notice all these places where chunks of fresco had fallen down. I started to notice these shapes, these gaps. And I began to base the panels I made, this is Giotto, by the way, the panels I made on these gaps in the fresco. So these are 4 early panels based on shapes where pieces of fresco have fallen down. And I was treating the panels very much the way I was the wall, sort of clusters of little tiny images sprinkled over this surface. And then I went on and made a number of panel paintings that tried to be narrative. They tried to carry from one panel to another. So the little running people, I don't know if they reappear anywhere else, but they're supposed to be the implication that they travel through to this place. And doing kind of lame-ish things like well, that's not terribly lame, but trying to line this thing up and, you know, have a kind of flow through. So I was trying to, I guess, basically set time in motion, because that is not a tiny painting. It would take up a good 3/4 of this wall. So in order to see the little gray panel, you'd have to walk quite a long way through. Some lived time would have to enter into your experience of the work. What am I doing? Oh, there's the little running people. I don't think they do end up there, but again, trying to make these things work with each other so as to bring, in a kind of awkwardish way, bring time into the painting. I don't mind these as paintings. I actually kind of like them, but they didn't do what I wanted them to do narratively. When that did happen, though, I don't think this was quite the same thing as a hunch, but it was pretty close. I cut these 3 separate pieces out of masonite. So just imagine them brown, cut out of masonite. And they were in the studio for a really long time, and every time I looked at them, I thought, I can't do that. I can't do that. Because for all that my work has been about paradise and journeys to heaven and so forth, I'm actually an atheist. I didn't grow up in a Christian household at all, and anything that I know about Christianity, I know as a reader, really, rather than a person of faith. But I could not get away from the Annunciation with these 3 things. And I kept looking at them and thinking, how could I possibly make an Annunciation painting? There's no way I can do that. But I couldn't get away from it. The flying angel who has just arrived, the seated Mary, and the speech, "You are with child." I couldn't not see it. So finally I said to myself, all right, deal with it. If this is an Annunciation, what is the Annunciation but the perfect version of how a story might work? So an idea is conceptualized, God thinking, it might be a good idea to have a child. And I don't mean to be blasphemous at all. Please, I should be careful not to be flippant. Then the story is told, and then it becomes manifest. So it seemed like a good, in some ways I think I'm kind of prevaricating. I'm trying to say, okay, I'm not really making an Annunciation painting. You can cut it whichever way you want. It probably is just an Annunciation painting. That said, I don't think I would expect any viewer to understand that. You'd have to have incredibly sharp eyes and be a very generous viewer to get the story that I saw myself in the studio. So what I did with this, I took the idea of the flying figure and made it just into this little magpie. So that's the side of the angel. And then with Mary, the kind of conceptualization of the story, she has 2 floral patterns painted. Oh no, she has 2 floral patterns painted on her. One is just a pattern taken from a piece of textiles. So it is a very stylized pattern. And the other is a naturalistic view of weeds that were growing in our garden. And then the speech where the story becomes manifest, these are all paintings of weeds from our garden with a little medieval bird's nest in the middle of it. And in a way, this piece, this painting, 3 panels, 1 painting, was just such a significant work for me in terms of what it allowed me to do. And I'm not saying, it's a great work, but in terms of what it allowed me to do. So there's the birds, the weeds in the garden and the bird's nest. And it led pretty directly into this piece, which is called Journey's End. And while I wouldn't expect a viewer to look at Annunciation and be able to read the story, I don't think it would be terribly difficult for a viewer to look at Journey's End and be able to understand there's actually a story that's going on here. Not least because of the title, Journey's End. So it begins with these, arbitrarily enough, it begins with these little people that are being held up by 3 kind of faceless, large figures, let's call them gods. And then there's 3 text panels. There's the little guys. Relatively naturalistic, cartoonish, yes, still, but starting to be naturalistic. The spatiality is allowing for that kind of thing. Then there's a desert and a mountain, and to show you that those people are traveling, I think I have a detail. There's a cloud with little feet there, and there's another cloud with little feet there, to show you that those people kicked up dust and traveled across the desert. Oh, there's the desert. There's the cloud. To show you that they traveled from one place to another. There's the mountain with the cloud. Oh, the cloud again. Then there's a blast of gold, and finally there's paradise. And the 3 little white panels with the black text on them, these were things that are taken fairly directly from biblical stories. So as you may well know, the beginning, I think the beginning of the Bible is in the beginning there was the Word. And so my little people in the pouches predate the Word. The Word is what set everything into motion. And you may also know that in medieval painting, God is, gee, I can't even think of a medieval painting where God actually is represented, but his word is represented by bands of gold or by gold text. And so once again, God has spoken and sent all these people into paradise. But it's the same kind of paradise that existed in the peaceable kingdom drawings, which is to say, it is a peaceable kingdom. The animals are very happy. But the people have just arrived, and they're spilling into paradise, and it's a question mark as to what will happen next. So they're kind of doing these face-offs, like the lady with the magpie and the naked man with the bear, and they're all through this painting. At the same time that I was working on those panel paintings, I was still really interested in the kinds of things I could do on a large surface, like the surface of a wall. And this is a wall painting called Days Are Where We Live at the Museum London in London, Ontario. That vault is, I think it's 28 feet high, so it's a big high drawing, big tall drawing. And it's another very simple story. It's a different kind of story from Journey's End, which I think has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is a much more open kind of story. So it begins, this is sort of the representation of the world, and it's at the very top of the drawing. And then there's a cleft in the earth, and all of these people are coming out of the cleft in the earth. And what they're going to do is run through the world and look at their history. So the landscape, in my mind, this is a landscape, and these people can run through that landscape. And things like this are representations of the history of these people. So you can, I hope you can follow what I just said and see that this is a representation of their history, and this is them looking at it and thinking about it. There's been times when I've showed this work, and people have asked me how I actually constructed it, because they believed that the wall was built out on a kind of substructure. It isn't. It's trompe-l'oeil, but it's what I love about trompe-l'oeil, what I love about representation, what I love about trompe-l'oeil is that it works to a certain point and then suddenly it collapses. So at a distance of about, I don't know, anything from about 8 feet back, and you could get a long way back from this, these things actually really do look like they're cut right out of the wall. At 8 feet, you're suddenly going, wait a second, that's completely flat. And I really love that kind of threshold moment when you believe something is true and all of a sudden you realize actually that's not true at all. So anyway, suffice it to say, it's all just paint on the wall, and these things are making reference to those model landscape railways that model landscapers, railway enthusiasts like to build. I should pick up the pace. I'm kind of slowing down a bit. Let me just go through this very quickly. You can see why I turned to panel painting. I think I worked on this thing for, I think it was something like maybe 7 days, and the duration of the show was a pretty long show. It was 8 weeks or something like that. But after that, it was gone. You can see why I kind of, occasionally want to work on a panel. But it was very fun working on this big wall. If we could have the next carousel, Lucy. So after I finished Days Are Where We Live, I think the next thing that I'm going to show you is more sewn drawings, I think. I can't remember, actually. I have to wait and see.
Pardon me, do you pre-plan, do you map out the narratives at all before, or do you work just extemporaneously on the wall?
That's such a great question. Like I said, this is 28-foot wall, and my studio had a 7-foot ceiling. So I could only ever work on tiny little bits at a time. So what I would do, I have these binders and binders full of images that I've collected over, the whole time I've been working. And I will arrange, in the studio, I'll arrange clusters of them and think, okay, these will work. But then when I'm actually in the space, it might turn into something completely different. But the one thing, this is one of those hunches that I actually really like. When I was in the studio, and my wall is short, it was like, at the time, it was like a 7-foot wall. It was a short little wall. I was in there one day and I said, I'm going to paint a blue horizontal stripe right across this thing. And I had no idea why. It was just like a really strong hunch to do that. What I realized, I have no idea how I had figured this out. What I realized is that if I hadn't painted that blue stripe, that wall would have started to sag backwards. And I didn't want it to do that. I wanted it to remain very vertical so that these guys were as close to us, as it were, as these guys down at the bottom. And I think that's what the blue stripe does. I think it pulls it up to the vertical. So even though that doesn't really answer your question, it does have something to do with the kinds of preparatory stuff I might do in the studio.
So you do a rough cartoon kind of.
Yeah, just of pieces though, because these are really big walls. So, and
You do smaller ones. You don't do it like small.
no, I don't. I do them to scale, like a 1-to-1 scale. And like what I did in the studio, for example, was I'd do one, and I'd paint it over, and then I'd do another and paint it over, just so I had practiced, really. And I just finished doing a wall painting in Toronto that I was very nervous about, and I should have practiced. I just didn't want to. I just didn't want to, and so I didn't. And it worked out okay. So maybe over time I've got overconfident or comfortable or something. What I do want to show you actually was, so at Museum London there are these two matching vaults, and on this side, these trompe-l'oeil passages are painted as if to look as if they're cut away, and on this side are paintings on white panel that project out from the wall, not much, maybe, I don't know, 2 inches, and they are the same kinds of shapes as are existing there. So they're like the positives to the negative of the wall on the left-hand side. I'll just show you these very quickly. These are jumbly. These are, there's a sort of material quality to these things that I like, but narratively, they're just kind of chaotic. But I do like the material quality. So when I had finished that show, I went back to drawing. Drawing's kind of like a linchpin for me, and I continuously return there. And I found these big cloths, these big tablecloths in the Goodwill. So this is the original sewing on the found tablecloth. And this is an applique from a man's leisure sweater. This stuff is just cloth that I've appliqued on, and then there's some passages of embroidery. And this drawing continues on from the idea of the peaceable kingdom. It's called Keep Ithaca Always in Your Mind. And the sort of idea of the drawing is that here's the earth, completely degraded and blown up, and these explorers are looking to another planet. And as if we're not doing that, I mean, now they're talking about seeing if you can grow things on Mars or something. Like, why don't you just deal with what's going on here? Just leave Mars alone, or Saturn, or wherever it is. Mars, I think. You know, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'll get off my soapbox. So just a detail of Ithaca. Another drawing in the same kind of vein of a degraded Earth and other planets. Whirling planet of garbage, again on a found piece of textile. And a big drawing called Last Judgment. And once again, this was a kind of little shoehorn into another piece. This is another applique from a man's leisure sweater, and it's these golfers. So in this Last Judgment, you guys know the story of the Last Judgment. In this particular Last Judgment, the golfers are punting all these poor people into all different kinds of industrial hells. Huge highways, acid rain, cooling towers, garbage, and so forth. You know, more garbage up there. And that became the drawing that led to a wall painting that I did at, is a detail, the Dalhousie University Art Gallery, and I think it was 2002, a big Last Judgment. And the specter of Mike Harris was still with me. So I saw the devil as, or the evil god as Mike Harris and his cronies. And this is the earth where the poor people are running up and down in despair and trying to figure out what they're going to do. This was one of the, I think this is actually the first wall painting I've ever done or piece I've ever made where images from contemporary life were coming in. So this is a little Lebanese captive, and there's some guys here. It was a medieval manuscript image, but I changed it into soldiers in battle fatigues. Unfortunately, they look more like they're doing calisthenics than anything, but so I'll just show some details. I don't know why I put 2 of that in. Oh, there's the battle fatigue guys. Yeah, anyway. there's the poor little captive. With that piece, with that wall painting, I made a group of shape paintings called Disasters and Bliss, and I discovered that in one particular year, in like 2002 or something like that, there was a tidal wave, flood, drought, tornado, just a series of very violent environmental events which seemed unusual to me. So I made a series of paintings based on a disaster on the one hand and bliss on the other. I'm just going to show you these very quickly. I actually don't think they're very good paintings. I really like the idea, and I'd like to come back to this someday, but I don't think they're as well made as they could be. So there's people being blasted into bliss, and there's bliss. And so the one we just looked at was the tornado, and this is drought. What I like in these I don't actually think they're, as I say, good paintings, but I like the structure. So there's the event, and then there's people on the margin looking in. And I think it's a structure I'd like to use again someday, but use better than I did here. This is the only wall painting I've ever made that has been kept. It's called Moral Tale with the Devil on Wheels, and once again, it's about the degradation of the earth. And this is the devil riding on a little scooter, and God blasting the earth, and all the people being sent off into, I guess, into the abyss. There they go. There's the devil. Around this time, I made a wall drawing at St. Mary's University Art Gallery. The idea for it was just people on a bus. At the time I made this drawing, I had quite a young child, and a really talkative child, and a busy guy. And so my day was full of listening to my son talk and talking back to him. And the only time when he kind of stopped was when we were on the bus. And then he'd be busy looking out the window, and I would have like 10 minutes to myself. So I really loved going on the bus. And it made me think that whenever you're on the bus, there's all these people that are together, but they have their own private thoughts. And so here are all these people sitting together, but their thoughts are incredibly active. And one of the things that I've asked myself over and over again through the years is, look, if you're so interested in narrative, why aren't you a filmmaker, or why don't you make animation, or all these kinds of things? One of the things I like very much about painting is that because of its enormous flexibility in terms of suspension of disbelief, and its enormous flexibility in terms of spatiality, you can have things going on time-based in painting that might be harder to do in film. So I don't quite know how you'd actually do something like this in film, simultaneously an image of a person and their thoughts. But it works fairly well in painting. You could probably do it in animation, but it seems to work more easily there than in any other medium. And I'm not trying to say that that all things being equal, there aren't times when I really wish I was a filmmaker because of its natural relationship to narrative, but painting brings its own gifts in terms of space and time that can be really well used by the painter in terms of narrative. So there's some people thinking their thoughts. I really got to pick it up. After I did that whole kind of series of work, I was reading the newspaper one day, and I came across a true story that seemed really, really interesting to me. It was so archaic. And it was the story of the Prince of Nepal, who had gone to his father. I think this was in like 2002, 2003 maybe. He'd gone to his father and he said, I would like to marry. And the father said, I will consult the soothsayers. So off he went, consulted the soothsayers, who told him, if your son marries this particular woman, you will die. So the king went back to the prince and said, sorry, no can do. And the prince was incensed and shot his whole family and himself, leaving behind the uncle who was out of the country at the time. Well, that is such a Shakespearean story, don't you think? I mean, it's an incredible story. And so I decided I just had to use this story in some way. And because it seemed so Shakespearean to me, I thought, well, what would Shakespeare do? Shakespeare would have the uncle set the whole thing in motion. That's why he was out of the country at the time. So this is the first version of The Prince that I did, and it's a tondo. And I decided, because almost the first word that came to my mind when I heard about the story was Shakespeare, I decided to set the whole thing up like a stage. So here's the stage. There's the uncle, who's not very happy. He's not on the throne, and he's not very happy. He's crouching on a little stool. The king on his throne, and the prince who's staring up at the girl, This is the audience that's made up of the uncle, the king, the prince, and the 3 astrologers. And here are the 3 astrologers reading the signs. So that was the first version of the prince that I made. And then I had an opportunity to do a show in Durham, Ontario, and asked them if I could do this whole thing again. They said, all right. So I did I told the story 3 different ways. The first way was a wall painting where you have a circular stage with all the players on it. And the players are cut out of aluminum and attached to the wall with magnets. And the idea was that the viewer could look at them and move them around if they wanted to. So they could actually change the story if they wanted to. Not that anyone did, but the idea was that they could. So that was the first version. I'm going to go through this fast. This is the second and third versions. In the second version, I've painted myself in all the parts of the story, and the third version is a text version that I tried to write as much like a folk story as I possibly could. A folk tale as I possibly could. I'm fast. So this is the prince staring at the boy, the king staring into space, and the uncle looking at the whole thing and thinking, I got to do something. There's the uncle, the tall, thin uncle. Now there's the uncle talking to the prince and the uncle talking to the king and the 3 astrologers at the back and the uncle talking to the 3 astrologers. Really kind of goofing around with time. Continuous narrative, really. The uncle watching the king and the prince and the uncle staring at the pool of blood. That's the end of the story with that version. The astrologers. There's the girl, and the girl gradually turns away and disappears into just a sea of blue. And the audience watching the play. One of the things I wanted to do was retell the story with me playing all the parts, because one of the things I was sort of concerned about was, well, I don't want to make a story about these people in Nepal that just don't know how to behave themselves. So it just seems like a really kind of classic archetypal story that could happen anywhere at any time. So I decided to tell it myself. This is me as the uncle testing out the throne and thinking it feels pretty good. This is the king and the prince arguing in the middle, the uncle staring in a kind of sleazy way at the top, and the girl at the bottom turning away. And there's the uncle in the pool of blood at the end of the story. And here's the text. I won't slow down enough to read it, but I tried to write it in a very folkloric fashion. This is the end of the story. So after Durham, I came back to Halifax and I thought to myself, I can do it all. I've got time, I've got space, I've got stories, I've got beginnings and endings, I can do it. And to my disgust, when I came back, I had no desire to tell stories at all. All I wanted to do, I had the studio with a kind of gridded window, all I wanted to do was paint little pieces of sky. And I didn't want to paint clouds, I just wanted to paint little pieces of blue sky or little pieces of gray sky. So what I ended up with was these drawings that looked completely abstract, which was horrifying to me. Not that I don't like abstraction, because I do, but I had never done anything like that before. So the first way I approached it was to say, oh, okay, well, I'll deal with this. I'll deal with the sky, but I've got to give myself some ground as well. So this is a drawing called Radiant Brilliant. This is radiant, and it's supposed to describe the experience of looking up at the sky in the middle of the day when it's so bright you feel like your eyes are completely dazzled. So you're looking up at the sky in radiant, and then brilliant on the other side. You're looking up at the sky at night when the stars are incredibly brilliant. And so you got day and night on either side of you, high up. They were like probably 12 feet off the ground. The paint pouring down onto the ground, and below your feet is this tape drawing. Oh, geez. This tape drawing of a city. And what I wanted to have happen was for you to physically have the experience that as you entered into the gallery, you're sort of lifted off the ground, and the sky was above you and the ground was below you, but you no longer had your feet on the ground. There's the city. And that work led to my despair and disgust and anxiety. It led to increasingly abstract work. And this is, again, a case of those hunches where you have a sort of instinct to do something and you can't get away from it, because I tried a lot. This was a show at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia called All Things Good and Pure. And in the process of making the work, I tried hanging down sheer cloth with figures painted on it. I tried tape drawings on the ground that included objects. I tried figures that were cut out of cardboard and stuck in front of these things. I tried everything. There was no way I couldn't make it work. The work had to be what it was, which was very seemingly abstract. I'm just going to go very quickly through the images to talk about the way they're not actually abstract. So 2 installation views. So it looks like a Rothko, but all it's trying to depict is the passage of time between dusk and darkness, and that's all I'm trying to show. But I am trying to show that. It's not a Rothko. This is the most pictorial of all of the images. It's called Little Path. It's built into an angle on the wall. I built a very soft, I think it was an 18-degree angle. So it wasn't a 90-degree corner. It was a very, very soft corner. You can just see it here, I think. And this little path goes right the way across the corner and then turns into a cloud of blue. Because of what happens when you do documentation, you can't see that this little path is going back and forth across the corner. But it did something spatially, I think, really wonderful as it crossed that corner. This is called Twig, and check this out tomorrow. We live so far north that all growing forms, trees, twigs, all plants grow in a zigzag pattern, and I think it has something to do with the axis of the sun during the day, or possibly between the summer and the winter. But check it out, it's true. Plants grow in this shape, and that's all this is. It's just showing you how the twig grows. So it's not a DNA, it's not an abstract zigzag, it's not some sort of motif that has anything to do with, I don't know, the ideal geometry. It's just a twig. And finally, black rain. And the idea for black rain was to take as many brilliant, thin, brilliant colors as I could and layer them and layer them and layer them until I ended up with a corridor of black. And I was thinking there about gravity, how gravity works. You don't see it, but it's incredibly powerful. So, so the hunch that led to this work was I just have to do this. I really like the work. It's kind of, I couldn't find a way of continuing, but it's kind of hanging there like a question mark in my mind. I do want to go back to this someday. There's the edge of black rain. And now, if we could possibly go to the computer just for the last few, I'm sorry you guys have been incredibly patient, and I just want to show you the last few clump of images. After the AGNS show, I had a period of about 4 years when I felt, which is sort of just ending, when I felt like everything I did ended up as a dead end. Oh, is it that? Oh, that's right. This is how I do it. And it was not a very nice experience at all. I feel like I'm just coming out of it now, though, so I'm not going to bother with that. That was early. This is a crummy slide. It's actually not a crummy slide. It's a very difficult piece to document. What we're looking at, this was made at the very end of the AGNS stuff, and it was a text piece cut out of plexiglass, so it's completely clear. And it's a bird caller's mnemonic, and what it says is, here I am, where are you? Here I am, I'm up here, where are you? Which is something, bird callers, when they're watching birds, they have these memory devices, and that's one of them to remember the call for this particular kind of bird, the red-eyed vireo. I'm not a bird watcher, but I did love that call, the idea there's someone out there saying, here I am, where are you? Here I am, I'm up here, where are you? And it continues this, I mean, I'm going to find out in about 20 years that I'm actually a profound Christian, because my work seems to continuously be talking about those kinds of things. I just don't realize it yet. So this is one of the dead ends. May go somewhere someday, but didn't for a really long time. It's just a drawing of the kind we were doing today in the drawing workshop, taking objects and cutting them out and just putting them on the wall at different degrees of spatiality. And they led to these watercolor drawings that are basically still lives. And in them I was taking different kinds of objects. So these things are drawings on that really thin tissue paper. This is actually a clay figure. This is a piece of paper that's been cut up, and I would set them up as still lives and paint them and try to see what happened spatially as a result. And I made a number of these. Yeah, just trying to test out what would happen spatially. And they led to these more complex, in a way, invented drawings where I took elements from all these binders of images that I have, including old sketchbooks with figurative drawings in them, and tried to compose these scenarios with figures in a very, very shallow, but plausible space. And I call these some theater drawings, because I was thinking about them as being very shallow stages. So that's 1, 2, which led in turn to these very tall drawings. This was based on the three fates, the Greek three fates, the fate that spins the length of a person's life, the fate that measures the length of a person's life, and the fate that cuts when the end of the life has come. These drawings are very tall. They're 10 feet tall and very dense. So if you think back to the AGNS work, which is so minimal, then to the watercolors, which are more airy, and then to the theater drawings, which get more dense, and now to these works, which are very dense, kind of going back to the density that I had in the stuff I was showing you from Museum London. Yeah. And they, in turn, led to a group of drawings that I made. I know some people here are heading off to New York, and I made these drawings about 1.5 years ago now, I guess. I went down to New York, and I've been a number of times, but I've never actually walked through Times Square before. And on this occasion, it was April, and I went for a walk through Times Square, and I was just blown away by the lights, and just these amazing lights. So I would actually, this is the nice thing about New York, I walked through Times Square over and over again with my sketchbook, and I just drew as I walked. No one in New York cares. If you did that in Halifax, you know, you'd look like a real oddball. In New York, they don't care. I could have taken off my clothes and had a rose between my teeth and done the same thing, and no one would have cared. It was good. I didn't do that, but it would have, I could have. So I made these New York drawings based on that experience of walking through Times Square. And as always, as is always true in my studio practice, I'm always interested in what's going on with the space and how you can play with the space in drawing. So in these drawings, this pit is based on being in the subway and looking at those underground pits. You can see a sort of blue light deep in them. And then looking up at the signs and looking way across to a distant vista. So I'm, you know, kind of playing with a curved space, as it were, almost. So down, across, and up. And those drawings are leading into these paintings on panel that play with the same ideas, but in a more kind of careful way, maybe is the best way to put it. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the most recent hunch, which has been for about 1 year. Just like when I was doing the stuff at the AGNS, I really wanted to just paint the sky. Right now, my strongest impulse is to work from life. And so even though I look at this work and think, boy, I just don't know about this. This feels like it could be, I could have lost all of my kind of inventive power and all of my pushing the boundaries of the kinds of things I've been thinking about. In other words, this feels like it could be very traditional, very conservative work. I still have a very strong impulse to do it. I'm just going to follow it. You know, what can I lose? So this is the most recent work based on figurative observation combined with drawings that I've taken from sketchbooks. And the last thing I'll show is the wall piece I just did in Toronto, which was in a fairly small room at the Gladstone Hotel. First thing you see is this cloud that's made up of the things that I heard in Toronto as I walked through the streets. Then you come around the corner, so the cloud is on the far left there. You come around the corner. These figures that you can see, the sort of bent leg guy and this guy here, are cut out of canvas and attached to the wall in a sort of floppy way. But I think they do something. There's the guy again. Oopsie, sorry. This is the city. It's based on those New York drawings. A detail of the subway pit there. Come around the corner into a sleeping countryside, and you come around the corner again, and you're into the Queen Elizabeth, what's it called? Queen Elizabeth Way Expressway, and that's the end of the room. So I kind of blazed through that, having showed a ton of work. But if anyone has any questions, anyone's endurance is still there, and you have any questions or any comments, please dive in. The biggest problem, I think, for painting right now is that we don't actually have very knowable communal narratives. So I suppose I could do a narrative about Paris Hilton, because everyone probably in this culture would recognize her. But how deep could that narrative be? It could tell us something, but it'd probably be a relatively shallow or short-lived narrative. But the problem for painting, like, the thing that was great for painting for hundreds of years was there were these Christian stories that everyone knew. So even if the pictures were really oblique, people could still put the story together. And now it's just a lot harder. Unless you do something very simple, sort of poster-like, it's a lot harder. So in answer to your question, I want to get as close to legible narrative as I can, but at the same time, I don't want my narratives to be sort of punch in the face, super simple. So something like Journey's End, you know, the painting with the little pouch people ending in paradise, pretty simple story, can't really tell us too much about character, can't really tell us too much about experience. It can only be a sort of gloss on a story of a journey. And so the problem always is, how do you get closer to telling us about specific person's experience and the specifics of a story. One of the examples that sticks in my mind really strongly is a painting by Bruegel called The Massacre of the Innocents. You know the painting. And so The Massacre of the Innocents is a biblical story. I actually don't remember the precise ins and outs of it, but the soldiers come to, is it Bethlehem they come to? And they kill all the firstborn sons, or maybe it's just all the children. Maybe it's just all the sons, I can't remember. But anyway, they come to the village and they kill the babies. And Bruegel has painted this as a horrific scene with you know, babies being dragged from their mother's arms and dead children and mothers screaming and crying. It's a horrific scene. And in the back of the painting, the large painting, and the crowd is in the foreground, in the very back of the painting, there's two dogs. And one of them is doing that sort of dog thing, kind of bowing down, kind of like, do you want to play? And another dog is going, sure. And it is so lifelike in that painting, because we've all seen that. And that's what dogs really do. And if dogs really do that, then this must be true as well. If that's true, then this must be true as well. There's a beautiful description by Norman Bryson. He says, truth lies in the peripheral and in the small detail. And that makes so much sense to me. So if you can only tell really broad stories and you can't get close to specifics, you're destined, you're doomed to stating the obvious. And you know, that's fine. I continue to try to find a way to be able to be specific about someone's specific experience. It's just terribly difficult. That makes so much sense to me. And like what I've found in my practice is that drawing almost always precedes everything else. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know why at this point I still have the prohibition against including that kind of text directly with image, but I'm hoping to break that down, and that might answer this person's question someday of being able to actually describe a specific experience. The woman I don't know if you recognized her over and over again, but there's one model I've been working with a lot, a woman called Aura, and she is a great storyteller, and she tells amazing stories about her life, which has been very interesting. So why could not some of her stories start to enter into those paintings? It's so funny with, I don't know if you find this in your own work, but for people like myself, or maybe just people that just censor themselves over and over again, although I want to be able to just kind of tell these stories, why can't I do that? I don't seem to be able to. I have to get to it. It's almost like I have to work really hard to get to it. No, I'm really excited to hear you say that. I'm not, but you know, to speak personally, which may or may not be appropriate, you know, I'm 50 now. When I was at art school, when I was in my late 20s, I wanted to be a star. I wanted people to write about me and people to show my work, and I wanted to be famous. And I still want that, but it's not going to happen. So now I have we live in suburban Halifax, the studio's behind the house. I love my studio work as passionately as I did back then, and now I know that I make the work for me, and so maybe that's where that relaxed attitude comes from, that at the end of the day I'm making the work because I really want to make this work, and so I don't have to be as kind of fraught as I was 20 years ago. I think that's such a great comment, because if you think of what I was saying at the beginning, when I went to art school, painting could not be narrative, it could not be spatial. You know, I came out of art school kind of bent double. And again, I should reiterate, I don't know if that's what my teacher said. That's what I learned. So I don't want to say, oh, I had an education that crippled me. What I want to say is, that's what I learned. Anyway, so I came out of art school feeling like I was completely bound up, and maybe that's the guilt that you're talking about, that I'm gradually loosening all these things and kind of feeling guilty about it, like, I shouldn't be making narrative paintings, I shouldn't be making spatial paintings, but I'm going to anyway. Well, that is something that I'm going to need to think about. I think that's such a perceptive and interesting comment. I'm going to go home and think about that one. I'm going to worry about it now. I'm going to feel guilty. Again, that's so interesting, because what I haven't been thinking about it. What I have been thinking about is the collapse and representation. And when I get back to Halifax, the painting I'm going to start, for Aura, my model, I've made her a suit. It's a white shirt and white pants. And on the shirt, I have taped with bias binding. I've taped a belly button underneath the breasts and elbows. And on the pants, I've taped, I think, very slight hip bones and knee bones. And so when she puts it on, the knee bones may or may not line up with her own knee bones, and the elbows may or may not. So when I paint her, her elbows are going to poke out the shirt in the elbow place, but the elbow bones that I've taped on may or may not line up. So there's going to be this thing between the real thing and the representation, but then both of them are representations. So spatially, what I'm hoping is there'll be the kind of collapse that you're talking about in terms of simultaneous narrative. But so definitely spatially, I'm working with that kind of collapse, and I haven't been consciously, at least, working with it temporally. But maybe that's there because of the spatial collapse as well. I think that's so interesting, because the city drawings are also really bound up with kind of spatial collapsing. Those floating figures are really big. And they're in a very weird space. They're sort of floating between you and the city. So they're a very odd scale in relationship to everything else. Spatially, they're in a strange place. And the pit's also strange in relationship to the stuff that's around it. Oh, well, that's another thing worth thinking about. Well, you've been so patient and so generous with your comments. I just wanted to thank you.